Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening to our members and our many guests participating in our program from around the United States and Canada. And for those of you who joined early, I hope you enjoyed the selection of music by Canadian artists who are obviously popular on both sides of the border. No doubt many of you will observe that I'm showing my age for some of the selections. So we are recording this evening's event, and we'll post a link on our website under recordings. They'll be available probably by tomorrow. So if you want to share it, watch it again, what have you, you can always do that. My name is Larry Cimino. I'm the volunteer president of the Indiana Council on World Affairs. And on behalf of all of our volunteer board of directors, it's my pleasure to welcome our members and our many guests this evening for our distinguished speaker program on Canada and the United States, so close yet so different. We've wanted to do a program for some time about that country to the north of us across the longest unmilitarized border in the world, which buys more goods from the United States than any other country in the world. And looking at the talent we have on our board of directors, we realize that we have two formidable experts on Canada-US relations who have dedicated a huge part of their academic career to research on this subject. The timing couldn't be better. In addition to the Winter Olympics, where Canada has already picked up 20 medals, including gold in women's hockey by beating the US, the world's been watching the chaos caused by a group of Canadian truckers. But more about that in just a minute. I wanted to mention a few things about the Indiana Council on World Affairs and our programs. In addition to our monthly distinguished speaker events, this winter we again present the Great Decisions series over 8 successive Tuesdays. At this point, they're all via Zoom. So Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on world affairs. We'll be sending you additional information about next Tuesday's program on Russia and disruption. So join us if you can, or contact us to learn how you can set up your own Great Decisions discussion group in your community. Later this month, 38 teams representing high schools from around the state of Indiana will compete in our annual academic World Quest competition, with the winner representing the state of Indiana in the national competition, and we'll be sending that team off with their coach to participate in the national event. But as an educational, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization with an all-volunteer board, we really pride ourselves in organizing and hosting timely events on international importance in a format that promotes respectful dialogue and exchange of ideas on a wide range of topics. So for more information about the Indiana Council on World Affairs and all of our events, plus membership and sponsorship opportunities, please consult our website. It's indianaworld.org. So after the initial discussion this evening between our distinguished speakers, we'll open the floor to your questions, and we do encourage you to participate in our Q&A by using the chat button, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Many of you have already sent in some questions, which we'll try to address if time permits. The Indiana Economic Development Corporation is our season sponsor. They're committed to attracting and supporting new business investment, creating new jobs for Hoosiers, and furthering Indiana's reputation as a top state for business. I also want to thank all of our sponsors and donors to this program. Every single contribution helps us deliver on our mission. Thank you very much. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our two distinguished speakers for this evening, Dr. Pierre Atlas and Dr. Kenneth Holland. Dr. Pierre M. Atlas is a senior lecturer at the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. Prior to joining IUPUI last semester, Pierre was a professor of political science at Marian University, where for 17 years he also served as the founding director of the Richard G. Lugar Franciscan Center for Global Studies. Pierre's ties to Canada are both personal and professional. A native of Texas who grew up in California, he did his undergraduate studies in political science and history at the University of Toronto. His wife is from Montreal, and his children are dual US-Canadian citizens. A comparative political scientist, Pierre has recently devoted his primary scholarly focus to comparing the United States and Canada. His research has examined how the legacy of the North American frontier helps to explain contemporary political differences between the United States and Canada on issues such as the role of government, gun culture and gun laws, and Indigenous policy. In addition to publishing numerous articles based on his research, Pierre writes a monthly opinion column for the Indianapolis Business Journal, and is a faculty affiliate at the Center for the Study of the Middle East at Indiana University, Bloomington. Pierre received his PhD from Rutgers University and his MA from the University of Arizona, both in political science. Welcome, Pierre.
Good evening, nice to be here.
Great, nice to have you. Dr. Kenneth Holland is President Emeritus of the American University of Afghanistan. He earned a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago and MA in government from the University of Virginia. He's a past president of the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States and past president of the World Affairs Council of Memphis. He's a scholar of Canadian foreign policy and has published numerous books and articles on Canadian domestic and foreign policy. He is currently finishing a book entitled Canada's Dilemma, responding to the competing Indo-Pacific visions of China and the United States. Ken first became involved with Canada in 1980 when he joined the Canadian Studies program at the University of Vermont. He has served as a consultant to the governments of both Canada and Quebec regarding implementation of NAFTA. He was a visiting professor at the University of Calgary, advised Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney during the Gulf War, and worked closely with the Canadian mission in Afghanistan, including the provincial reconstruction team in Kandahar. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Larry.
I'd like to start the program this evening by asking each of you to tell us how you got interested in Canadian studies, and specifically the comparison of Canada and the United States. Pierre, Ken, would you like to start by giving us a little background on your interest in Canada?
Well, as you mentioned, I did my undergrad at the University of Toronto. I was born in Texas, grew up in California, and I went for various reasons as an undergraduate to University of Toronto. And I was immediately struck as a 17-year-old American studying political science there, some really interesting differences between the two countries. I mean, you would sort of assume that there's a lot in common, which of course there is, but different attitudes about the role of government. I'll give you a quick anecdote. There was Ontario, the province of where Toronto is located, had a film censor board, and all films were censored before they were shown in theaters in Toronto. And as an American, I was completely shocked by this. I said, "What about civil liberties and freedom of the press and all that, freedom of speech?" And I talked to my Canadian counterparts, my fellow students, and to a person, they said, "This is for our own good. This is for the good of society." And I really, from that point forward, I just became interested in this comparison. And then as a student, I learned about the difference between the Canadian West and the American West, and how they were developed very differently, much less violent on the Canadian frontier. I found that very interesting. Jump forward 30 years, I was a comparative political scientist in focusing on the Middle East. And I had a student come into my classroom, this is back at Marion, wearing a t-shirt that said, Canada, living the American dream without the violence since 1867. And that really struck me as representing both the history, but also the mythological differences between Canada's self-image and America's self-image. And that sort of got me going into sort of this new research agenda, which I've been doing for about the last 5 years, including presenting papers at the Association for Canadian Studies conferences that Ken has been the president of. So it's been a really interesting and enjoyable studying agenda.
Yeah, I first became involved with Canadian studies, as you mentioned, Larry, when I joined the faculty at the University of Vermont. Burlington was only 40 miles from the Canadian border. And one of my colleagues came into my office my first day there at the University of Vermont. And the only question he asked me was, "Do you like to travel?" And I couldn't say no, so I said yes. So then I joined the Canadian Studies program there at UVM, and Canada had a program called Understanding Canada. And so they provided funding to support research about Canada, but also travel to give talks all over the world.
Everybody can see your name.
About Canada. And I went to some very interesting places. One of my most memorable trips on the behalf of the government of Canada was to Moscow in 1991. And you can imagine what it was like there after the fall of the Soviet Union. But I went to many other countries as well. And because my dissertation was on American constitutional law, I became interested in Canada's constitution, Canada's judicial system, wrote a book called Comparative Judicial Systems, in which Canada was one of the 5 countries I selected for study. I also became very fascinated with free trade between Canada and the United States, and then the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement really struck my interest. I wrote an article about Quebec's participation in the negotiation of NAFTA that led to a lot of attention in both Canada and the United States. Became a consultant for both the government of Canada and the government of Quebec to try to take advantage of the trade opportunities. And then later, I became very interested in Canada's foreign policy. So the last several years, I've been writing books and articles about Canada's foreign policy. And that, again, has taken me all over the world. And so it's been a very enjoyable and a very rewarding interest of mine. And I'm glad always to help promote interest among Americans in Canada.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Ken. Thank you, Pierre. Well, the chaos caused by the group of Canadian truckers in Ottawa and along the border with the US has garnered international attention, not only for its audacity, but also because it seems so surprisingly un-Canadian. What do these incidents reveal to us about Canada today, and how Canada is similar to and yet different from the United States?
So I'll take a crack at that. And what I'd like to do first is I'm going to share my screen. And I just want to sort of go over very quickly, especially for some people who may not be familiar with the extent of Canada. This is a basic map. Here we see Canada and the United States. And Canada is a geographically larger country than the United States, but about 1/10 the size in population. So we're talking about 38 million population for Canada compared to 331 million for the United States. To put that in perspective, California has about 39 million. So there are actually more people in California than in the entire country of Canada. And about 90% of Canadians live within 150 miles of the US border, all along the border. And so that's an interesting thing to keep in mind too. And that also underscores the very close symbiotic relationship really between the United States and Canada. A lot of Americans don't necessarily think about Canada so much, but certainly the Canadians are much more aware of the United States. Hang on, let me just a second here. Whoops, shoot. Hold on. Okay, sorry about that. I need to have it on a slideshow. Okay, there we go. All right, so the protest, what we're talking about here is basically this is going to be, we're going into the 4th weekend of basically the Canadian truckers. They call themselves a Freedom Convoy, occupying the grounds of the national capital of Ottawa. And here you can see in the upper right-hand corner, you can see pictures of protesters in front of Canada's Parliament. The lower right pictures are also the truckers in Ottawa. The bottom left is the convoy in British Columbia trying to make its way down to the border with the United States. And then the upper left, which has ended now, but we are all probably, this is where it really made the American news, was the truckers basically shutting down the Ambassador Bridge between Windsor and Detroit. And this is what that looked like. And we can talk about how this signals a lot of the differences between the two countries, but also some interesting similarities. There's COVID fatigue among people. Frankly, a lot of Canadians for the past 2 years have been kind of locked up in their homes watching a lot of television. And what a lot of Canadians watch is American television. And so a lot of the protests that were taking place in the United States, the influence of Trumpism, a lot of other kinds of things, definitely has entered the Canadian Canadian right-wing politics, and has definitely influenced it. And I think a lot of Canadians on the far right have taken some signals from the Americans. And now this type of protest that the Canadians have sort of developed of truckers is actually inspiring some other people in protests in other countries. They've tried to do it in other countries in Europe, and some American politicians have even called for Americans to do this as well. What this has led to, though, and this is where we're seeing some interesting differences, is the government of Prime Minister Trudeau a couple of days ago invoked the Emergencies Act, which is a very sweeping act that's been on the books since 1988. It's never been invoked before for a national emergency, and it allows sweeping powers to the federal government that we just don't see in the United States. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is a federal force, has now is authorized to help enforce local and provincial law, and they're doing that in Ontario and in Ottawa. It's basically declared these protests unlawful assemblies. It's now legal to take a minor child to these assemblies. Banks are being ordered under the law to freeze the accounts of truckers that are protesting, and also to the government can seize cancel the truckers' licenses and insurance as well. Various private entities can be ordered under the law to render assistance to the government for essential services, including tow trucks to pull the trucks out, including banks to be involved in a lot of these shutting down of assets. And the idea is to sort of starve the people out, to force them to leave. Also, they're being given notices that you are now committing an illegal act, and you must vacate, otherwise you will be arrested. And that's what this picture is at the bottom right. And then finally on this slide, something that happened that is actually quite shocking in Canada. And this is sort of one of the things that I study is gun culture and gun laws and gun violence in the two countries, going back to frontier times. And Canada has very strict gun control, and the idea of radical extremists armed with weapons is probably the most un-Canadian thing of all. And the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, seized a cache of weapons. Many of these would be prohibited weapons in Canada on the Canadian side of the border in Alberta. These were some extremists within a trucker convoy in Alberta that were going to go they were on their way to a border crossing to block a border crossing between Alberta and Montana. And these people were arrested, about 13 people. And apparently they had expressed a willingness to use violence against the police if the police tried to stop them. And so this is a really shocking kind of thing, which leads me to the last slide I want to show before I'll pass it on to Ken and we can continue with the conversation. But that is, Larry mentioned, the image of Canada, the idea of there's a term for Canada back in the 19th century, was called the Peaceable Kingdom. And Canada, from its origins, has always tried to be different than the United States, especially in the realm of violence, whether it was towards Indigenous people, gun control, a lot of other kinds of things. They saw the Americans as more unruly. And this led to a very famous thesis by an American sociologist, Seymour Martin Lipset, who basically suggested that Americans are more libertarian, Canadians are more communitarian. And this is just a quote I want to show you from an academic journal article from the American Review of Canadian Studies, which is the academic journal of the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States. And this was actually looking at young Canadians and young Americans, and it confirmed a longstanding academic argument about the two countries. And I'm just going to read this real quick. Americans are more likely than Canadians to engage in general criminal behavior, and especially violent crimes, more likely to support their right to bear arms and to resist attempts to regulate firearms, less likely than Canadians to express respect for the legal system, and generally more acceptant of violence and disorder in society than Canadians. And this strikes at one final point, and that is that whereas the United States, the American political motto in some ways from the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Canada's political motto from the act that created the unified Canada in 1867 is peace, order, and good government. And that really is sort of what has been stressed by Canadian society. 2/3 of Canadians are outraged by these protests and are totally against it. This also leads to the support for this Major Emergencies Act, which is very controversial even in Canada. But the idea that the government has this level of authority in an emergency to basically restore peace, order, and good government is something that really strikes as a fundamental difference, I think, between the United States and Canada, even as they're responding to protests that might look kind of like an American type thing. Anyway, I've said more than I wanted to, but I just wanted to sort of share some of those initial thoughts, and I'll pass it on to Ken.
Yeah, that's a great overview, Pierre, of the current unrest in Canada. And what I'd like to do just briefly is point out that Canada is no stranger to insurrections, rebellions, riots, violent challenges to the legitimacy of the government. So this is a background I think that's helpful for us to understand what's happening now. In 1837, there were major rebellions in both Upper Canada and Lower Canada. Lower Canada later became Quebec, and then Upper Canada later became Ontario. The reasons for the rebellions were different. In Upper Canada, the English-speaking population was opposed to the oligarchy, which ruled them, and they demanded responsible government, parliamentary government, democracy. That was a very violent rebellion. But even more violent was the revolt in Lower Canada, where the French Canadian population protested against their domination by the English-speaking minority. So there were many riots, lots of there were lots of use of firearms, and it was two violent revolts, both put down, by violent means. And then a few years later, in 1849, by that time, Canada had been united. So there was a united Canada. The purpose of uniting Canada was to assimilate the French-speaking population. So there was a lot of resentment among that population against the Canadian federal government. And so they burned down the Parliament building in Montreal. So the capital of Canada was in Montreal, and the French-speaking rioters burned down the Parliament building. And then later, after Canada was formed as a confederation in 1867, as Pierre mentioned, the Northwest Mounted Police were formed, now the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And what's interesting about them is that they are a federal police force, not a provincial police force, a federal police force. And their very first responsibility was to put down a rebellion in Western Canada. There was an independence movement by the Manitoba Métis, who were descendants of a mixed population of Native people and French-speaking people. So they were French-speaking living in Western Canada. And so there were two rebellions, the Red River Rebellion of 1869 and the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. And again, this is very interesting. The RCMP, again, violently suppressed the two rebellions, and Louis Riel, the leader of the second rebellion, was tried in Ottawa and hanged. So that was a very serious and violent protest. So that was a challenge to the legitimacy of the Canadian regime and a demand for independence. Then in World War I, there were conscription riots. And this is the origin of the War Measures Act that Pierre mentioned. So French Canadians didn't feel any loyalty to Britain. They didn't feel any loyalty to France. And they didn't see why they should risk their lives and die on the battlefields against the German army. And so there were violent riots in Montreal and Quebec City in 1917 and 1918. And what's interesting is that the War Measures Act was passed on August 22nd, 1914, just after the outbreak of the war. And it actually resulted in the sending of Canadian soldiers to put down the riots. So there were over 150 casualties on just one day, April 1st, 1918. So the first time the War Measures Act was invoked, it did involve the sending of Canadian armed forces to put down the riots. And then again in World War II, there were conscription riots. Again, 1942, 1943, 1944. The riots were centered in Montreal. Again, the French Canadians did not want to die to help Britain maintain its independence. And then the October crisis of 1970 was the first time the War Measures Act was invoked in peacetime. And it involved, again, the use of force to put down a independence movement in Quebec. A Canadian, Laporte, was murdered by the kidnappers. So it was again a violent uprising and put down with military aid. And then, of course, we have the Freedom Convoy truckers of 2022. And as we know, as Pierre mentioned, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act passed in 1988. So this French element is really critical to understanding Canadian history and Canadian politics. And one reason why Justin Trudeau does not send troops to Ottawa is because the government of Quebec is always afraid that the Emergencies Act might be used against them. So this element of of Quebec not feeling totally committed to Canada and always questioning the legitimacy of Canada is a kind of a permanent theme in Canadian politics.
That's really interesting. I like to. The narrative is very important that you identified, and what's interesting is even the two the 1869 rebellion, Red River, and then the Northwest Rebellion, both led by Louis Riel, as you said, was Métis, which was mixed race between Indigenous and French, predominantly French Canadian, and the way the Canadians put that down, the English Canadians put those rebellions down, was they didn't see it. It was not an indigenous, like an Indian uprising like we had in the United States, where it was not seen in that sense. It was seen through the lens of the French-Canadian question. And so that was one reason why it was so, there was a very hard response to it. For the first one, the Mounties hadn't been created yet, but one reason why they were created was this concern. Interestingly enough, in these rebellions, and then also even in the 1837 rebellion in Ontario, there was support from Americans. Americans were actually hoping that they would use this as an opportunity in 1837 to basically overthrow the British in Canada and bring Ontario into the United States. So you had this cross-border kind of support, and the same thing with the Métis, because there were some Métis in Montana too, and so there was sort of this support as well. And you had Fenians, who were sort of Irish Catholic Americans, who were very anti-British and anti-Canadian, who were sort of linking up with the Métis, who were also Catholic. And so you had all these kinds of interesting cross-border collaborations, in a sense, between sort of extremists. And in some ways, we're seeing that today with the fundraising. A lot of the funds that the so-called freedom truckers were getting were coming from the United States. And now with the new Emergencies Act, one of the things they're doing is they're shutting that down, which is kind of interesting too. So you have nobody's actually trying to get people to break up Canada anymore. But it's sort of, there's some continuation there that's very interesting. Yeah, so I think it's fascinating. At the same time, overall, this idea of quick responses to internal violence, because it's unacceptable in Canada, and that's sort of what's happened. Like I was talking about the FLQ, the October 1970 crisis, in my terrorism class today, actually. And at the time, people thought this was a huge movement, but then afterwards they found out at its height, the FLQ, the Quebec Liberation Front, only had 35 people, but they had set off a whole bunch of bombs. They had, as you said, they had kidnapped a minister and assassinated him. And the Canadian government, Trudeau's father, sent in the military. Basically, it was martial law under the War Measures Act. And so the Emergencies Act that we have now, that Canada has now, is very different. Canada now has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, similar to the American Bill of Rights. And the Emergencies Act, which was passed in 1988, superseded the War Measures Act, and it's very limited. It's 30 days. It has to be passed by Parliament. It'll be interesting to see if the vote comes, if the Bloc Québécois, which is a Quebec party in national parliament, will actually support it. They may not, just because of the memories of the FLQ, but it does look like the New Democratic Party will support it, and because Canada has the Liberals have a minority government right now, so it will pass. It will go forward, but it's going to be pretty interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, Pierre, actually, I'd like to follow up with what you said and really point to a very interesting comparison between the riots that took place in Seattle in 2020 to protest the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the truckers' blockade in the city of Ottawa. If you go back to those events in Seattle in May, June, July, and August of 2020, what you see there is a refusal, of the police department in Seattle, a refusal by the, city council in Seattle to take any kind of decisive action. In fact, the police actually abandoned one of the precincts in Seattle and turned over the entire neighborhood to the protesters. And Donald Trump saw this as an opportunity to win some favor, with his constituents. And so in June of 2020, Trump deployed federal law enforcement forces to Seattle. And the Department of Homeland Security cited an executive order regarding monuments, memorials, and statues as allowing federal officers to be deployed without the permission of individual US states, as the federal government has the right to enforce federal laws, investigate crimes, and make arrests within the states. So this was a major point of conflict between liberals and conservatives. And when President Biden came into office, he immediately revoked the Trump executive order authorizing the sending of federal law enforcement to cities to restore order. And in Ottawa, we saw something very similar. So Ottawa had a police chief named Peter Slowly, and he had been with the Toronto Police Department. And when he was in Toronto, he actually gave us a speech in January 2016 in which he said, "Until policing stops being focused and driven on that reactive enforcement model, it will continue to be exponentially costly." So he actually wanted a smaller budget for the Toronto Police Department, and he didn't want the department to be a reactive law enforcement force. And so he ended up being forced to resign from Toronto, and then of course was picked up by the city of Ottawa. But he refused to take any action against those. There were 4,000 trucks in downtown downtown Ottawa. There are now about 360 trucks still remaining there, blockading the streets in front of the Parliament building there in Ottawa. So he refused to take any action because that kind of law, very vigorous, robust law enforcement was not something that he was comfortable with, as a police chief. But of course, he then was fired because of the unhappiness of the residents there of Ottawa. So you do see a lot of common political currents in both Canada and the United States. And we also see this in countries like France as well. So we're in this very interesting period of the development of modern democratic politics, where the issue of law enforcement and the role of the police is very central to that discussion.
I think that's really fascinating. And what's really interesting is Ottawa is it's almost the exception to the rule. I don't know if a lot of Americans realize this, but the national capital of Canada, Ottawa, is not a federal city. It's just an ordinary city with an ordinary police department. It's not like Washington, D.C. But we did not, you'll notice that you did not see this type of occupation in other major cities in Canada. And it really does speak to leadership, to a particular police chief's interest in, maybe being too nice, I guess. So what happened in Toronto at the same time, so you have Ottawa in Ontario, it's the national capital. Toronto is the largest city in Canada, and it's the fourth largest city in North America. And trucks were going towards Toronto a few weeks ago. And the Toronto Police Department, fortunately, no longer headed by the person who moved to Ottawa, Slowly, which is a great name, Slowly. But anyway, he lived up to his name. But what the Toronto Police did is they were monitoring social media. They had good intelligence, and they said these guys are coming. And what immediately shut down all the roads around Queen's Park, which is where the provincial parliament is. So Toronto is the capital of the province of Ontario. Ottawa is the capital of the entire country. Both of them are located in the province of Ontario. Toronto shut down everything, and they didn't allow any trucks to get anywhere near the provincial parliament. And the same thing was happening in a lot of other cities across Canada. And it didn't happen. You had a few trucks getting in there, but they were immediately issuing tickets. They were arresting people. They shut off all traffic around Queen's Park, which is where I used to, when I was at Victoria College, U of T, which is on the other side of that park, and Parliament's on one side, and they shut it all down. And so you had different attitudes about how you respond to this. Ottawa, which is interesting, the Ottawa Police Department didn't know what was coming. They didn't take it seriously. They were immediately overwhelmed. And because they didn't nip it in the bud, you get these big trucks there and you can't move them. So it was immediately they came in and they basically did an occupation, and they're still there, and they're in the process now of leaving. We'll see what happens there. Today, just this afternoon, one of the major leaders of the movement was arrested by the Canadian police, either Ottawa police or RCMP or whatever. Now the RCMP is actually authorized to enforce local and provincial laws in Ontario. So things are going to start moving. But it's been an embarrassing 3.5 weeks for Canada, that basically you had their national capital taken over by these protests, and it's interesting. So
also there's a parallel between the blockade of the streets in Ottawa by these truckers and, of course, the attack on the U.S. Capitol building on January 6th, 2021. And what fascinates me is the symbolism. So, Pierre, weren't you fascinated to watch these protesters in Ottawa waving Confederate flags, waving Nazi flags, waving "Do not tread on me" flags?
Yes.
So they were invoking the same symbolism that those insurrectionists, those pro-Trump rioters were using, on January 6th. So symbolism is very, very critical to understand both right-wing movements. The flags, the placards are very instructive.
There is a wave of right-wing populism that's taking place in a lot of countries. And again, particularly with the United States and Canada, there's a tremendous amount of exchange of information. Canadians are much more aware of what's going on in the United States than typical Americans are of what's going on in Canada, especially if you're not near the Canadian border. But Canadians watch American television. They see things. There were Canadians from 2016 on that were pro-Trump, and they wanted someone like Trump to take over Canada. A very small minority, again. I mean, the vast majority, 3/4 of Canadians are against the protest movement by the truckers. But you do have this strain, and it's also regional. And this is a really interesting thing about Canada is different than the United States in that sense. Much of the protest movement, the reform movement that sort of merged with the old Progressive Conservative Party to create the new Conservative Party of Canada, which is the second largest party in Canada. It was very strong in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Alberta is sort of like called the Texas of Canada. It's the place where you'll see the most gun ownership among Canadians, although it's heavily regulated. Handguns are heavily regulated in Canada, but you will see this, and there is a sort of regional, and it's also there's a very strong divide in Canada between urban and rural, which is also very similar to the United States. And you do see a lot of these parallels. But this idea of contagion, the flags, I have to say that the "Don't Tread on Me" flag I think was really funny because that's from the American Revolution. And when you think about it, the Americans who were loyalists, they went to Canada, and Canada was, what they call the Counter-Revolutionary Society. And for these protesters to be flying flags from the American Civil War supporting slavery and from the American Revolution, talk about un-Canadian. And it kind of makes you wonder where are these people getting their stuff from. Is it authentically Canadian? Although, as Ken pointed out, there is a long history of rebellions among some people in Canada, just like you'll find that in any country. And so people are tapping into that too. But it's very interesting, and we'll see what happens in the next few days. Do they dismantle their trucks and leave peacefully, or is there going to have to be some force used? Clearly, the Canadian government does not want to use force at all. They want to de-escalate, but they are now they have many arrows in their quiver that they can actually use to punish and really ruin these people's lives and their careers if they continue to do these things, which is now unlawful.
So Larry, I think it's now time for Q&A. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, we'll turn it over to the audience. We've had a number of questions come in, and some people have asked some questions in advance. Okay, I would say there have been some interesting comments also, and we didn't get to some of the things that we thought we might get to. So I think we can pick them up now. I think some of the questions refer to the number of right-wing extremists that might be in Canada, whether they form the same, whether they're similar to the groups in the United States, whether they're extensions of those groups in the United States. And what percentage of Canadians do you think that might be referred to as right-wing extremists? Actually, you could ask the same thing. What percentage might be considered left-wing extremists too? And how do these groups perhaps differ from those in the United States that would label themselves that way or be labeled by each other that way?
Yeah, if I could comment on that, Larry. So the common understanding is that the percentage of right-wing extremists in Canada, is lower than that in the United States. But I think it's very interesting to compare the Conservative Party in Canada with the Republican Party in the United States. And what we saw this, truckers' protest has really put a lot of strain on the Conservative Party in Canada. At first, the leader, Aaron O'Toole of the Conservative Party wasn't right-wing enough. And so he was actually booted out of he lost his leadership position in the Conservative Party, and his firing was precipitated, by this truckers' protest. And so many members of the Conservative Party have come out and expressed sympathy. We're anti-vax, we're anti-mask mandate, we're anti-COVID restrictions, vaccine mandates, and we're the party of freedom, the party of individual liberty. At the same time, I noticed recently the Conservative Party leadership, Candice Bergen, the acting leader, she asked the truckers to disperse because she said the Conservative Party stands for prosperity. You're hurting the economy of Canada because the auto companies are shutting down their factories because they can't get parts from the U.S. So you're hurting the economy. And then secondly, you're practicing disorder, and we're the party, as Pierre said, of peace, order, and good government. You're being disorderly and disruptive. So it really caused to bring to the surface the tensions within the Conservative Party of Canada. But I think this protest has moved that party further to the right.
I agree, and I would add a couple of quick things. The Conservative Party of Canada that exists today came into existence around 2003. Before then, you had what was called the Progressive Conservative Party, and that goes back many generations. And that was a kind of a center-right party that supported the Canadian healthcare system. It was kind of more like conservative, but kind of like maybe like an Eisenhower kind of conservative. And there were a lot of people more on the far right, especially in Alberta. There's been a separatist movement in Alberta, kind of like with Quebec, they say, you know, Alberta, the oil should belong to us and we want to leave and maybe join the United States. It hasn't really gone very far, but you had sort of a tension within this. And the Progressive Conservative Party basically ceased to exist. And the new one, what was left of it, merged with this Reform Party, this more extremist party. And so that sort of is part of the roots of where the party is torn apart, the way Ken was talking about just now. And the trucker thing really brought it to a head in some ways, because you have some people who really want, they're egging on the truckers. They want this. They totally agree with it. And there are other conservatives who are saying, if we want to win an election, we actually have to appeal to the moderates in the country. Canada has 5 political parties, and there are 5 parties represented in Parliament. And the last elections were just in September. So it's already been, the Canadians already voted. And so for the Conservative Party of Canada to actually increase seats, they already have the right wing. If they want to get more seats in Parliament, they have to appeal beyond their base. It's a little bit different. The dynamics are a little bit different than the United States. The other thing that's really different about extremists, to get back to Larry, your original question, and I completely agree, it's the numbers are small in the United States. But another thing is the level of willingness to engage in violence just isn't there. That's what was so shocking about these 13 people that were arrested with this cache of weapons and high capacity magazines and all this kind of stuff at the border just a few days ago. You know, in the United States, we have this term DVEs, domestic violent extremists, and we have a whole bunch of categories that the FBI uses, and we have, you know, like all these different groups that were engaged as domestic violent extremists in the January 6th, whether it's the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys, and you have other kinds of things. We have neo-Nazis. There's always a few, you know, kind of people like that in Canada, but the idea of people training, militia movements, training to take over the government, that attitude, the idea that people have the right to rise up and overthrow the government, that basically was taken out of Canadian political culture with the American Revolution. And on the American side, you have a much greater willingness among extremists to embrace violence and to prepare for violence and than you do on the Canadian side. And I think that that's an important cultural difference. And then the laws are also different in terms of the availability and access to firearms, much more heavily restricted in Canada. All those weapons that you saw in that picture I showed you are all completely legal in the United States, and any American could have those who doesn't have a criminal record. Those weapons are prohibited in Canada, and you have to either have special permits or they're completely banned, outright banned. Most of those are actually outright banned since the 2020 mass shootings in Nova Scotia. So those are illegal in Canada. They're completely legal in the United States, and that's another important distinction to keep in mind.
Actually, to follow up on that a little bit, Pierre, there have been a number of questions about that same topic, the difference in guns, gun culture, use of violence, and particularly been some people took exception to the comparison of January 6th in Washington, D.C. and what's going on in Ottawa, particularly from the standpoint of the lack of violence. And while there were flags, there were very few flags in Ottawa that were the right-wing Proud Boy kind of white nationalist, rebel, Nazi, those kinds of things. Obviously, it makes good TV, but there probably weren't very many of them compared to Washington, D.C. I wonder if there's anything more we want to say, though, because this difference in guns and gun culture, and then the what you call the contagion. I mean, who knows how many guns cross over from the United States to Canada, and is there? You caught one truckload of guns, but is Canada arming itself? Because the exportation of guns from the United States, both north and south of our borders, have contributed significantly to violence in our hemisphere. So how does, I guess, do we have an inoculation, or if you would say, against violent gun culture in Canada because of our history and our mythology? And is that something you want to talk a little bit more about? Because I think this is fascinating.
Yeah, I can actually, let me quickly share my screen again. I'll make this real quick because I know we're in the interest of time. Hang on here. Whoops, wrong screen. Let me do that real quick again. Where'd it go? Okay, whoops. I'll just have to go. Hang on. Let me bring this up here. First of all, Canadian gun laws are very different than they are in the United States. As we've noted before, Canada, the Dominion of Canada, the unification of Canada as we know it today was in 1867. 10 years later, Canada passed its first major gun law, and all firearms laws in Canada are federal. And it banned the carrying of handguns without a clearly demonstrable need for self-protection. That was in 1877. That was at the same time as we think of the American Wild West. In Canada, they refer to a Mild West, despite the uprisings that we talked about before. In Canada, there's been registration of handguns has been mandatory since 1934. You have a large, about maybe 35% of Canadians may have long arms in their homes, but not that many Canadians have handguns. Handguns are tightly regulated. And then you also get these different categories of firearms: non-restricted, which is ordinary rifles and shotguns; restricted and prohibited. And after this, there was a major mass shooting in Nova Scotia. They don't happen very often in Canada, but you had some serious new laws were passed by Parliament. Over 1,500 different types of assault rifles were banned outright in Canada. And they basically literally had a list of all of them. And so all AR-15 type platform rifles are now illegal in Canada. So that's what I was saying, that those are what you saw in that picture are illegal. You have to have a special permit to purchase anything. You have magazine restrictions, as I see here, 5 rounds on semi-automatic rifles and 10 rounds on handguns. And there's also a couple of interesting things. To get this purchase and acquisition license, you have to actually state your conjugal status, and your partner has to be informed that you are applying for the permit to purchase a firearm. So if this is actually aimed at domestic violence and things like that, you also have to have references with contact information required in order to get it. The idea is that there is no constitutional right to own a firearm in Canada. It is a privilege granted by the state and heavily regulated. So that is a really important difference. And I would say, let me just back out of here. I would say that does speak an important difference also between January 6th and what was happening in Ottawa. I think the comparison, or putting them in the same category, is the idea that both were protests aimed at the capital of the country. But clearly January 6th was a lot of things, including an attempt to overthrow the government. I mean, in a sense, to actually stop the lawful transfer of power in a democracy. And it was an organized, and we're finding out more about it all the time. It actually included elements of domestic terrorism. And I think it was obviously much more serious than what was happening in Ottawa. But I will say that the few of the people in Ottawa, some of the real radicals, and again, when you're in a mob, the loudest and most radical people can ruin your message. So a lot of the people were there because they're just frustrated, they're fed up, they didn't want to have a vaccine mandate to cross the border. These were the truckers were striking, and so some of the people were just like, I'm fed up, I want these laws changed. But there were other people who were saying, the prime minister has to resign, and we want to change the entire government. We want to eliminate parliament and have the governor general, who's the Queen's representative, run the entire country. Canada just had an election in September. I mean, so you had these wacko kinds of things going on, and drowning out everybody else. And so, and other people saying, Alberta has to secede from Canada. So you had all these kinds of strange things going on, but you really have not had the kind of violence, neither from the protesters, and certainly not from the police either. They're waiting them out and all this kind of stuff. But it's gotten to the point where it's hurting the economy. People in Ottawa can't, it's 24-hour. They're blaring their horns, their air horns, 24 hours a day, blasting loud music. And this is a residential neighborhood of the capital, and people are sick of it. They're losing their businesses, everything. Yeah. Sorry.
Actually, Larry,
one last quick question.
Larry, I wanted to follow up really quickly. One of the most important differences between Canada and the United States has to do with policies toward abortion. And it's a very, very, very divisive issue in the United States. And it looks like the US Supreme Court might actually overturn Roe versus Wade and remove the constitutional right to abortion. In Canada, it's not really an issue. Abortion is freely available. And this reminds me of a very interesting novel written by Margaret Atwood, a Canadian author, The Handmaid's Tale. And basically what she argues is that America is basically a Puritan country, with this fundamentalist Christian, foundation, and that United States may become very repressive in the future, but Canada will always be a refuge for those Americans who feel victimized, by this religious fundamentalism. So that's another difference there.
Mhm.
And Canada
Okay.
did not have Puritans in the colonial era the way the American colonies did.
Yeah. Let me wind up the gun piece, and then I want to ask both Ken and you about foreign policy in Canada, not just U.S.-Canada policy. But first of all, one quick question: have the arms that were seized, have they been sourced to an American source? Do we have any idea where they came from and
Great
who is
question.
providing
I don't
those
know
arms
the
to
answer.
Canada?
It just happened a couple days ago, and I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know if that's been found out yet, or if they're still in the process of tracing it. That's a good question.
Okay. Let's look externally, because obviously there are a lot of things going on in the world right now, and I know Ken's doing a book on Asia Pacific policy, how it differs between U.S. and China. We've got things going on with Russia. Canada's been involved in the negotiations with Ukraine and so forth. So, Ken, I know you look closely at foreign policy as well, and has advised the Canadian government on foreign policy over the year. What can you say about differences and similarities between the stand that Canada takes, what role they play in international dispute resolution and so forth?
Yeah, so Canada is what we call a middle power. So as Pierre pointed out, the entire population of Canada is smaller than the population of one American state, California. So it has a very small military. Its economy is only 1/10, that of the United States. So Canada is not a great power by any measure. But there's always been a tendency from time to time in the Canadian government to kind of declare its independence of the United States and to have an independent, autonomous foreign policy. But in the last time we really saw this expressed was during the Iraq War. When President Bush ordered the invasion of Iraq, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, Canada refused. Bush asked Canada for assistance. As you know, I advised Vice Prime Minister Mulroney during the Gulf War, and Mulroney was very pro-American. But at that time, Jean Chrétien, the Prime Minister of Canada, refused to assist the United States in its invasion of Iraq. Later, however, Canadian leaders realized that was a huge mistake, because Canada is so dependent on the United States economically and so dependent on the American nuclear umbrella for its security that it really needed to be on side with the United States and needed to be America's closest ally. So I became heavily involved in the Afghan war, and I spent, one of my roles there was to work with the Canadian mission in Afghanistan. So you couldn't find, closer, stronger supporters of the U.S. military than Canada was. And so Canadian troops fought and died in the Afghan war alongside American troops. And so today, Canada is with the United States in its confrontation with Russia. Canada is with the United States in its confrontation with China. So there's this alignment now that didn't exist back in 2003.
I'd like to add to that. Canada is a member of NATO. I believe, and maybe Ken can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in Afghanistan, Canada actually lost a higher proportion of soldiers than the U.S. did in terms of killed in action. The proportion, yes, not the number. But another thing about Canada is, in addition to being a middle power, Canada does not have a lot of military power, but it has what political scientist Joe Nye called soft power. Canada has a lot of soft power, a tremendous amount of respect around the world, and it's leveraged that for a very long time. In fact, it was Canada that basically invented the United Nations peacekeepers. It was Lester Pearson, the prime minister in the 1950s, who proposed the idea of the very first peacekeeping mission, which was in the Sinai after the 1956 Arab-Israeli War. And so Canada has been a major leader there. So where it's not a major military force, it is out there in terms of peace. Canada was a major proponent of what's called responsibility to protect, which is a sort of a doctrine that kind of lost favor a little bit. But it was the idea that that the international community has a responsibility to intervene in countries that are committing, say, genocides against their own people. It was the Canadians that did this, and it was a very, very big deal. And as I learned very quickly as an American student in Canada, Canada was involved in both World War I and World War II long before the Americans did. As I said, we were always late to the game. They were there, from 1914 and from 1939 on, and they're very, very proud of their military record, even though it's a small country. You could say they sort of punch above their weight, but they definitely do take advantage, or they're under the American nuclear umbrella, which has also enabled Canadians the Canadian governments over time to devote much more of their economy and their tax base to social programs as opposed to military defense budgets. So their defense budget is not that large. It doesn't need to be. But that way they can do a lot of other kinds of things, including like national health care and stuff like that. And that's thanks to being under the American military guarantees and all of that. So that needs to be said too.
Yeah, so critics would say Canada's a free rider.
Free rider, yes.
So they don't have to they spend less than 2% of their GDP on the military. We spend, 7% of our GDP on the military. So, Canada is basically taking advantage of America's military might, and thus feels no obligation to spend a lot of money on its defense.
And it's not necessary. We'll defend them no matter what, because it's our continent.
Well, let's turn back inward. There's been a lot of information in the press recently about issues related to the indigenous populations. You mentioned it very briefly, but in association with focusing on French rather than focusing on the indigenous issues. But I know that, Pierre, you've studied some of the indigenous issues. How have our policies differed towards dealing with the indigenous populations and some of the wrongs that have been attempted to right now? And Canada's been very forward in this very recently.
So looking backwards in the past, and this is one area of my academic research, was the Canadians' approach, especially in the prairies, the post 1867 frontier, trans-Mississippi West in the United States. The Canadians approached their indigenous people very differently than the United States. They did not use kinetic violence. There were no Indian wars in Canada, and those two rebellions were not really Indian wars. So there really were no Indian wars. The military was not. There was no Canadian military. It was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the Northwest Mounted Police at the time. Basically, during the 19th century, the United States approached American Indians.
Well, we're losing you a bit there, Pierre. I think that you have you're frozen on our screen. I think we need to jump to something else.
Can you
and
hear
maybe
me now?
I think, Ken, can I pitch this to you? We've talked a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Actually, Larry, you're frozen.
Maybe I'll just keep talking then. Yeah, everybody can hear me? Okay, all right, okay. So the United States approached its indigenous issues with the military, with the army. Canada did it with the police, with the mounted police. It was a frontier police force. You had basically, before white settlers arrived in large numbers in the 1880s, 1885 or so in the Canadian West, the Mounties actually negotiated treaties with all the major Indian tribes or First Nations tribes in the West and got them on reserves, which is what they call a reservation, without violence. Now, at the same time, the Canadian government, their attitudes towards Indigenous people were just as bad as the American government's attitudes, just as racist, just as, the idea that we have to civilize them, make them Christian, all this kind of stuff. They use food as a weapon to basically, if ever anybody looked like they were getting out of line, because the First Nations were so dependent on the Canadian government for food supplies, especially once the bison were gone, out on the prairies, the Canadian government would basically just shut off their food to basically keep them in line. And it was very, very horrible. And then, of course, you had the whole thing with the residential schools, which is the big issue that Larry was talking about. I think we looked like we lost Larry. But the idea that basically kids were taken from their families, from their indigenous families, and they were sent to schools in which they were Christianized, civilized, had their hair cut short, forbidden from speaking their own languages. The United States did this as well, with like the Carlisle Indian School and other kinds of things, but the Canadians kept doing it into the 1960s. There was horrible abuses, a lot of sexual abuse, psychological abuse. Most of these schools were run by religious organizations, the Catholic Church, and also some Protestant churches, and some very, very horrible abuse took place. What is happening, I think this is what Larry was hinting at with his question, was what the Canadians are doing now is they've pulled the Band-Aid off the wound, and they have a what's called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the last several years, very, very detailed accounting for what was actually done, compensation for it, reparations are being proposed. Trudeau has formally apologized for what happened in the past. The Canadians are confronting their past. It challenges their own mythology because of the Peaceable Kingdom and the mild West and all this kind of stuff, but they're dealing with it. The United States does not have a very good record of dealing with its own past, whether it's with slavery or indigenous peoples or anything else. And the Canadians are actually doing it. It's causing a lot of pain, but they are doing it, and they're confronting their record, which is not really good. Compared to the United States, it's better, but on its own, it's not that great in terms of how they treated their indigenous people. And I don't know if Larry
Actually
gone?
I can take over here. So
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
that's all right. So kind of on a semi-related area, what's happening with the energy issues in terms of exporting of oil and coal and so forth, the United States, and pipelines, and how is that playing out in the relationship between the United States and Canada?
Ken, you want to
Happy
take a stab at that?
Yeah, I can comment on that. So Canada is the largest source of energy for the United States. So it's the largest source of oil, of natural gas, of hydroelectricity. The city of New York is largely powered by hydroelectricity from Quebec. The oil sands in Alberta are one of the world's largest reserves, of petroleum. So Canada is definitely an energy superpower, and the U.S. is heavily dependent on Canadian energy. At the same time, Canada tries to be a leader in climate change, and is a signatory to the Paris Accord. It's trying to become carbon neutral. But this is a major split, Ray, between the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party says it has no intent whatsoever of meeting those Paris Accord targets because, as Pierre mentioned, the base of their support is in Alberta, which is totally dependent on fossil fuels for its prosperity. And then Alberta provides tax revenue that is then transferred to other provinces in Canada. So if there were a change of government, then you would see a change in these Paris Accord goals, this movement toward a green economy and carbon neutrality.
Could some of that be underlying some of these protests in Ottawa?
Well, I think the truckers are kind of interesting because I think it originally was Alberta truckers. Am I right, Pierre? Because they were very unhappy. They were in the US driving their trucks back to Alberta. And when they got to the border crossing at Coutts on the Montana-Alberta border, they were told they had to be vaccinated, fully vaccinated in order to cross the border. So I think it really started at that one border crossing, right?
That's where it started, and then the convoy actually went west. So the so-called Freedom Truckers began in the Canadian West, and then they drove to Ottawa. And as they were driving across Canada, they're picking up more and more people. But yes, it started that way, very much so. But I think in terms of the protests, it really is related to mask mandates, and Canada's, they've had a lot more shutdowns and quarantines than the United States has, and there's been a lot of uneven communication from provinces, from the federal government, kind of like in the United States too, and it just led to a lot of frustration, especially for truckers who did not want to get vaccinated. But at the same time, Canada has a much higher vaccination rate than the United States. I was looking this up before our talk, and 83% of Canadians over the age of 5 are vaccinated. 83%. That's a lot higher than the United States. There's much more compliance. So you're still talking about a minority, but it's a very vocal minority. And when you park trucks in front of a road and block it, it doesn't take a lot, as we saw with the Ambassador Bridge. So don't think that they represent necessarily a majority, even within the Conservative Party. As Ken said, I mean, even the leader is saying, we need to back off from this. But they're definitely tapping into some frustrations that a lot of people have had for 2 years, and we're seeing that. Look, I mean, we're even seeing it in blue states in the United States. People are just getting tired, either anti-vaxxers or people that who have done everything right, who got their vaccinations and they're boosting and they wore their masks and everything. They did everything right, and they're seeing other people not doing it, and they're frustrated too. And they're starting to say, wait a minute, we're done with this, right? So you're getting this sense of frustration, and these protesters definitely tapped into it. But then they also sucked in neo-Nazis and people who want to get rid of Parliament and all that kind of stuff too. When you put a mob together, you never know who's going to show up, right?
I see Larry's back, so I'll turn it back over to
I'm
you.
back. Ray, thank you for jumping in. I've never been kicked off of the program before. I hope it wasn't something I did. And I presume I'm back.
Yes.
Maybe somebody could nod because
You are.
Okay, great. Yeah. So, well, listen, I think we have time for one more question that's come in. There's been a couple of questions about immigration policy in Canada versus the United States. I know that they're different, and it's one thing actually Pierre and I have talked about when we both were in school at the University of Toronto. There were so many foreign students there, and many of them looked forward to staying in Canada. What in general are the differences we see between immigration policy in Canada and whether or not they attract young students to study and stay, and what are their policies, and what are the active immigration channels that you have now in Canada versus the US?
Well, I'll just say a couple of quick points and I'll pass it on to Ken. First of all, Canada has a larger percentage of foreign-born people in the country than the United States does. The United States has the largest number of foreign-born in the entire world. We have like 45 million or so, but Canada has a larger proportion than the United States. And their image is not the melting pot, it's the mosaic. And I think in many, now there's starting to become an anti-immigrant backlash as well, and some of that feeds into this protest too. You have this sort of right-wing xenophobia, but that's fairly small in Canada. But there is a greater acceptance in general of immigrants. And then, as you just pointed out, you hinted at the idea of foreign students coming in for education. The Canadian government and the legal system is set up to encourage them to stay and take their knowledge and contribute to Canada, as opposed to saying, okay, your student visa is over, now you got to go back to where you came from, which is the American attitude. So we actually, as Larry pointed out in a conversation we had, the United States basically brings all these people in for higher education in the United States, train them, and then we send them back because we don't want them staying. And Canada has a different attitude about that. And I would just that's all I would say. I'll pass it on to Ken if he has anything more to say about that.
Yeah, one of the interesting changes in Canadian public policy is the attitude toward Asian immigrants. I've probably written more than 25 articles on various aspects of Canada. And the one that is cited most often is an article I wrote several years ago describing the effort by Canada and by British Columbia to exclude Chinese immigrants. So both the province and the federal government had Chinese exclusion acts similar to those in the United States. Justin Trudeau has apologized to the Chinese Canadian community, for what Canada did. And also the War Measures Act was actually used in World War II to intern Japanese Canadians. So Japanese Canadians were placed in concentration camps just like they were in the United States. And what really drives this change in attitudes toward immigrants is demographics. Canada is a much older country than the United States. Canada has a much more extensive social safety net, a social welfare system. And the only way to fund that system as the population ages is to recruit more young people, to work and pay taxes. So Canada is actually in a much worse position than is the United States in terms of sustaining its social welfare system because its population is so old. So it's desperate for immigrants who can take jobs. Their attitude toward the Afghan allies is commendable. Many of my former students and staff members from the American University of Afghanistan have now traveled to Canada. Most of them are in the Toronto area. Some are in Ottawa. So Canada really welcomes immigrants, especially those who are educated and willing and younger and willing to work. So they are hard pressed by their demographics.
Let me just show this real
Thanks.
quick.
I think we have time for one more question.
Can I just
go
show
ahead.
this real quick? This is a population pyramid, and this is some of you may be familiar with this is using demographics. The one on the left is the US versus Canada. And basically, if you look at it, the Canadian is skinnier at the bottom, which means it has fewer younger people than the United States does. And if you notice near the middle part here, 59, 60-year-olds, there are more of them than the United States. And that just sort of confirms the point that Ken was making about the United States Canada has a more aging population, more older people in the pyramid and fewer younger people in the pyramid. I just wanted to show that, and I'll stop sharing.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. Well, I think we have time for one. I think Betty had asked a question. Betty Tonsing, are you there? And when I disappeared, all of the questions to me disappeared too. So this is going to have to be our last question from the group, unless somebody wants to just weigh in. Betty, go ahead.
Larry, we carried on. Can you just talk a bit about, I'm talking with this about my students right now. We have a very strong two-party system here in the United States. It's been very hard for any other party to go through. I'm finding that younger people would like more choice. They're not terribly interested in either Republican or Democratic Party. And can you talk about the Canadian system, Pierre, when you said there's 5 very strong parties active in Parliament, very similar civil societies, very similar in many ways, despite the differences you're pointing out, a lot of similarities. How would a multi-party system work here in the United States? Younger people seem to want it because they want more choice, but how do you think a multi-party system could fit in here?
Well, as long as we have the Electoral College with winner take all in 48 states, we'll have a two-party system. That's the answer. Okay. I mean, and I've told this to students for years. I mean, that's the Electoral College encourages a two-party system. There have been very rarely times in American history we've had more than 2 parties that one Electoral College votes at the presidential level, and that was when America was deeply regionally divided. Canada does not have, first of all, Canada has a parliamentary form of government, not a presidential form of government. It does not have Electoral College. Obviously, you don't directly elect the president because they don't have a president. But it has two regional parties. The Bloc Québécois, which is the 3rd largest party in Canada, is only in Quebec, and it's a national party for the Quebec opposition, basically. And the Conservative Party is predominantly, not exclusively, but it's predominantly in the Canadian West. Okay, and then you have the Liberals, which is the main party, and you need 170 votes to form a majority. In the last election, the Liberals got 160. They have what's called a minority government. They actually have the minority, but they're still running the country as a minority government. You have the major third party is called the NDP, the New Democratic Party, which is a social democratic party with 25 seats. But if you're looking at it, I've got the distribution. As of the September election, the Liberals have 160 seats, Conservative 119, Bloc Québécois 32, NDP 25, and the Green Party 2 seats, and that's it. Okay, so a lot of it is regional. But really the bottom line is, if you want to have more than a two-party system in the United States, in which a viable third party can win the presidency, and if a viable third party cannot win the presidency, very few people are going to run and have a chance of a third party candidate winning at a state level for Congress or for the Senate, because basically you pool your resources into the parties that have a chance of winning nationally, and that's why we have a two-party system. You have to reform the Electoral College, perhaps go to instead of winner take all, go to proportionally distributed per state. That might be a possibility where that might lead to more than 2 parties. But we have the structural impediments of the Electoral College. And then over time, these 2 parties have become thoroughly entrenched in American politics. They run elections, they run the primaries, they run the debates. So you have the culturally embedded parties, and legally the structure favors a 2-party system. And that's why we have a 2-party system. That's the main reason why we have it. And Canada doesn't have that issue at all. So I would tell it to all.
Do you have any
what I say
final
is,
comments?
Yeah, I mean, you want to vote for a 3rd party for president, you are, I hate to say it, but you're throwing your vote away.
Throwing the vote away. But you still have youth that feel disenfranchised with both parties.
People absolutely do feel disenfranchised. You can have, I mean, with winner take all, you could have somebody, who wins, 45% of the vote in a state. And if you have multiple candidates, that person wins all the Electoral College votes, right? I mean, whoever gets the plurality or the majority. Absolutely. It is and another reason, it's another reason why we have generally the lowest voter turnout of any advanced democracy, is because people feel that their votes don't count, right? So it's the system itself. And it would need to be modified before you'd have a viable 3rd or 4th party. Yeah, so.
Ken, what do you think about that?
Well, America has a 2-party system because of the single district and plurality system we have. So every state is divided into congressional districts. And in order to win a seat in the House of Representatives, you only have to win the most votes. You don't have to win a majority. And so that system of single member districts and plurality elections really discourages any 3rd party. So to me, that's the foundation of the 2-party system. In parliamentary systems, especially in a country like Canada, which is highly regional, as Pierre mentioned, there's room and space, for 3rd and 4th and 5th parties to emerge. So the parliamentary system, in conjunction with regional differentiation, allows these multiple parties to emerge in Canada.
I would follow up with that. What Ken was referring to is called Duverger's law, which is a single member district, first past the post or plurality will favor a 2-party system. But Canada has that same system. They have a single member district, first past the post also, but it's the regional thing. So you have even in those single districts, you'll have a place where a Green Party candidate can actually win a seat. Okay, so Canada also has that same type of voting distribution, but it's parliamentary, and the regional differences are very strong in Canada, especially when you look at the West and you look at Quebec, which they have their sort of their own cultures and political parties that come out of that.
Also, another important difference, Donald, is the Senate. So in the United States, the Senate is definitely a second house of the national legislature and has tremendous power. But in Canada, the Senate has very little power. The senators are appointed by the Prime Minister, and they're not allowed to stop legislation. So it's very similar to the House of Lords in Britain. So basically, Canada, you've got one house of in the legislative branch, and that's the House of Commons.
It's we call it asymmetric bicameralism. It's the British model, exactly. Yeah.
Well, let's be honest that the United States Senate is not representative of the United States populace.
It is the most. If you define democracy as one person, one vote, if you use that definition, it's the most undemocratic upper body of any in any modern democracy. The idea that you have an equal number of senators, equal number of senators for each state. There are other, like the Canadian Senate and other federal systems that have an upper house that represents provinces or states or whatever, don't have equal numbers per state. It's still based on population to some extent. And so the Senate is unique. Yeah, and it goes back to the compromises of the Constitutional Convention. Slavery was part of it. Also the fear of smaller population states being overwhelmed by large population states in the House. There are lots of reasons for it. But it is an 18th century design, definitely.
Is there any reason to think that perhaps lots of those reasons has to do with a really hard definition between a democracy and a republic?
Well, when the founders used the term democracy versus republic, when they were talking about a democracy, they were talking about an Athenian direct democracy, as opposed to republic, which is they meant a representative democracy. So really, I mean, those when we say, people say we're a republic, not a democracy, they're using 18th century language, whereas today we would just say, is it direct democracy, like a town hall, or is it a representative democracy? That's the way I would interpret it. So but there's different.
Is it really an 18th century definition, or does it go back to ancient discussions between the Roman Republic and what happened in Greece?
Well, that's sort of beyond the scope of this conversation. But I would just say that there are many representative democracies in the modern world today, where you have they may be more representative than, say, the U.S. Senate is. The U.S. Senate is very unrepresentative. I mean, when you have California with 39 million people with 2 senators, and Wyoming with 550,000 people with 2 senators, clearly there's a discrepancy there. That's not one person, one vote. And so there are problems with that, but that's the way the system is designed, and you'd have to sort of make some fundamental changes to the system in order to fix that, which I don't see.
Also, we should always remind ourselves, and Donald, you remind me of this, Canada is a monarchy. It's not a republic, it's a monarchy. The Queen is the head of state in Canada. So the Governor General, as Pierre mentioned, is the Queen's representative in Canada. So legally, Canada is a monarchy, not a republic.
I want to add something to that that's actually really funny. I was actually reading the actual declaration of the Emergencies Act that was signed that was issued the other day, and it actually has the Canadian symbol on it. It's in English and French, and it begins with this. Let me just read this to you. It says, "Proclamation declaring a public order emergency. Canada, Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom, Canada, and her other realms, territories, Queen, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith." And then it goes on to issue the thing. Okay, she's not just on the money. It is a constitutional monarchy, and it has these vestiges that a lot of, it's just interesting and strange, and it's kind of quirky. But the Governor General is now selected by Canadians. It's no longer selected by the Queen. But yeah, it is not. Canada is not a republic. Absolutely not. That's a very good point.
And another important difference is because the Prime Minister is not a president, like the American president. Remember, the American president is head of government and head of state. But in Canada, the Prime Minister is only the head of the government. And so he has much less respect among the Canadian people than, say, a US president would have. Mm-hmm. And the best example of that is question period in the House of Commons, where opposition members of parliament can say the most insulting things to Justin Trudeau, and there's nothing he can do about it. He has to stand there and absorb it and then hit back. In fact, he was sanctioned, I think yesterday, by the Speaker of the House for saying insulting things, saying that you are the same people who fly Nazi flags and are anti-Semites. And so the Speaker of the House says that's insulting language, that's not allowed. So that's another difference, is what you see during question period.
This is what happens when you ask 2 political scientists simple questions. You're getting a good tutorial on political science, though.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, with that, assuming I'm back in the group here, I keep getting knocked off. We probably should wrap it up. We're getting to the end of our time, and this has been really fascinating. And I'm sorry I've bounced in and out of this, but I've enjoyed listening. It's obvious that Canada and the United States are inextricably linked with the geographic realities of our extensive common border, our economic interdependence, as was said, and our intertwined histories. And yet some of the differences are really quite dramatic. And as with all communications, better understanding brings better engagement. And these programs are intended to help foster that better understanding of the world that we live in and of our neighbors. So for that, I want to thank our 2 distinguished speakers for sharing your time with us this evening. want to emphasize again that the talent we have on our board of directors and how that helps us deliver outstanding and really timely programs to you. It's you who we want to engage, and we welcome your feedback, and thank you for your participation this evening. Please mark your calendars for our next distinguished speaker program on Thursday, March 17th, when we will present what promises to be a really fascinating discussion about the Uyghurs of Western China, featuring Professor Gardner Bovingdon, who is Associate Professor and the Director of Graduate Studies in Central Eurasian Studies from Indiana University in Bloomington. I think we all can expect to learn something from that program, and I hope to see you all back again then. Our Great Decisions series continues next Tuesday evening with a program on Russia and disruption. So be sure to register and join us then. And you can find more information about all of our programs on our Indiana Council on World Affairs website at indianaworld.org, where you'll also find a recording of this and previous programs. So for now, on behalf of the Indiana Council on World Affairs and our board of directors, we once more thank our distinguished speakers, Dr. Pierre Atlas, Dr. Ken Holland, and all of you who joined us this evening. Wish you good evening, and I hope to see you all again very soon. Thanks, everyone, and good night.